Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's session. It's session 5 with Brin Hodgskiss, and it's all about the story and the power of the storytelling for aiding digital project delivery. I'm Karen Slay, and I'm a Senior Programme Manager with the South East Genomic Medicine Service Alliance, and I would really like to welcome you to this afternoon's session. Brin's going to be bringing fun and energy into the session. And also, if you've got any thoughts, questions, just drop them into the chat box. I would really like to hear your thoughts all the way through. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end and also a poll. So we'll have much of a good opportunity for you to have a conversation with Brin. I'm really excited to introduce Brin, who is the Head of Transformation Strategy at Digital Urgent and Emergency Care in the NHS England. And he's clearly opened his bio saying that over the last 20 years, he's not always done things quite right. And what he means by that is that he's brought his expertise from psychology training through policing, investigations, operational management, and a whole host of experience into large-scale change and transformation. And it's not just about the process, it's about the connections that you make and the power of storytelling. So Brin, I'm going to hand over to yourself, and everybody, I really hope you enjoy the session.
Thank you so much, Karen. I hope I can live up to that excellent introduction. Welcome everyone. As Karen said, my name is Brin Hodgskiss, and I'll be touching on the power of storytelling to aid digital project delivery. And actually, I'll confess up front, this is a bit of a teaser because we're going to have a follow-up series of webinars with dealing particularly with storytelling. And this is just a high-level introduction about why you should care about it and how you can potentially use it where you work. So starting at the beginning, as Karen said, my background's in psychology, and when I was doing my PhD, I was driving around maximum security prisons like this one on the screen, and I interviewed a number of serial murderers. And one of the things we were trying to discover is what makes serial murderers commit the offenses they do. And a common pattern that we saw again and again was the role that stories played in creating their offenses and being a reason that they continued to offend. And so, of course, I did what everyone did when you study. You learn something, then you forget about it and go into the working world. But then when I started to do more and more change management, something about that psychological power of stories started to come back in and give me a hint about another tool that we could add to the project manager's toolkit. So I was curious, so I did a bit of background work about looking at the neurology of influence. So how do our brains respond to attempts to influence us with facts? So as we say on the slides, normally we try to influence with facts and figures. And there's actually a number of reasons that doesn't work, but I'll mention just one specifically, which was a piece of research that was done at the University of Southern California, where they put people in a CAT scanner, which, as you know, it scans brain activity, or sorry, an MRI scans brain activity. And they presented people with statements that they could agree with, like kittens are cute, statements that they could mildly disagree with, cats are better than dogs, and then statements that they knew would wind the people up they had selected. So they selected people with very liberal views and gave statements as facts that would directly counteract those views. And what they found was that we respond to facts we don't like in the same way, using the same parts of our brain as we would respond to a direct physical attack. So there's no difference in our brain between a physical attack and a psychological one. And of course, we then resist. So I suppose the the next question you might ask is like, okay, Brin, that's all very well, but why are stories better? And another piece of research helped sort of give us some insight. Again, it's research around neuropsychology and brain functioning. But what they did is they got a narrator to speak about their first day of high school. And both the narrator and the listener had their brain activity recorded. And what they found was that the emotional activity, or the activity in the emotional centers of the brain in the speaker or in the listener, started to match that of the speaker. And as the story progressed, when you're talking about your nervousness, your excitement, your fear about high school, as people were talking, as the narrator was talking about that, the same nervousness, fear, and excitement was being identified in the brains of the listeners. Even further, the brains of the listeners would start to preempt the emotions in the speaker. So even before the speaker got to the embarrassing event or the happy ending, the brains of the listener were anticipating it. And the researchers actually called this a lovely phrase. They said it was the brains in storytelling show extremely distinct and widespread neural coupling. And if you looked at some of the brain scans that came out of that research, when you're thinking logically, there's just two areas when you light up. When you're thinking emotionally, when you're on stories, your whole brain is engaged. And one of my favorite quotes, and Daniel Kahneman, you might know him from Thinking Fast and Slow. He's sort of the godfather of behavioral economics and nudge theory. But one of the comments he made, and this is coming from an experimental psychologist, is no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. So let's bring it practically to digital projects. So what's the problem with digital projects? Why can they be so tricky to project manage? But what I'm going to do before I launch into the digital section, I was just wondering, are there any immediate questions from the audience, Karen or Agatha?
Nothing's come through at the moment, Brin.
Well,
so
that's my challenge to the listeners then, is to put in any questions you want to ask, any thoughts that might have been triggered, and then we'll hoover them all up, hopefully, at the end. So back to where I was. So what's the major problem with digital projects specifically? And I don't come from a technology background, but I've probably spent maybe the last 10 years of my career delivering change and transformation, and almost always digital forms part of it. But it was only when I joined the team I'm in now as a head of digital strategy, then when I realized that the big problem with digital is it's kind of like plumbing, kind of like your toilet. Nobody pays attention to your toilet until it goes wrong. Nobody cares about the plumbing until it gets blocked. And digital is very similar in a lot of ways. It's often hidden from view. It's also often not thought about until after a change has already been delivered. So what you often get is people will build an enormous change project and then afterwards think, oh, how do we bring digital into this? And continuing the plumbing analogy, the net result, and certainly something I believe we see in the NHS, is we end up seeing lots of portaloos dotted around in not a very joined up way. So the challenge in digital is to make it less invisible. And there are a number of ways we can use stories to do this better. And again, this is going to be high level, so I'm going to skim through. I will probably use some examples mainly from my own experience. Now, that's not because I've got the best stories or the best examples out there. I know there will be people out there who are thinking I've done this before or I know of a better example. It's purely because I'll only use my examples because I know I've got permission to use them. And if anyone comes out of those anecdotes looking like a numpty, it's me, which is as it should be. So how can we use stories to deliver digital projects better? Now, we can do this on 3 levels. And forgive me, I have mixed up the program and project nomenclature slightly. But at a portfolio level, first, so the highest level where you're thinking about a number of digital programs working together to deliver a very substantial shift in sort of organizational or national capability. How can you use stories in that context? So, and I'm just going to throw, these are teasers. One of the most effective ways I found of using storytelling is actually using a storytelling technique, simply using a metaphor. So find a metaphor which helps articulate the challenge you're facing. Now, I've just done that in my introduction by describing digital as plumbing, and the problem is joining up all the portaloos, because that metaphor, and I've practiced it in quite a few different board meetings, is something that people can engage with. And when I then go on to say, but the challenge in digital strategy is, before you build your city, before you build the city of the future, can you tell us the plans so we can make sure we've got the plumbing in place? Don't build the city, then tell us afterwards, because then we're still in Portaloo territory. And that's helped people understand certainly a lot of the role of digital in strategic planning. Now, the examples I've got up on screen are another example of using a metaphor to explain the role of the national digital products. So, which is what my team and sort of neighbouring teams to mine deliver, the National Digital Urgent and Emergency Care Products, that is. So, we've got the metaphor, obviously, of an overcrowded hospital. The hospital's under pressure. What we're designing is a safety net. And then what we did then is expanded that metaphor to be, well, yes, it's a safety net, but the safety net does 3 things. And you can expand that metaphor of the safety net. It connects people and directs them to where they need to go. So, so in the urgent and emergency care context, from 111 to GP out of hours, from emergency department to urgent treatment center, it can catch insights. So that is about the ability for digital products to create data. So you can see where people are moving in the system, and you can increase insight. But also that creates access. So rather than thinking about your only way to access urgent care is go to a hospital, you can actually go to any number of doors, and wherever you present, we will interlink in the background to get you streamlined to the most appropriate location quickly. And again, that metaphor then brings what can be incredibly full of jargon. It simplifies it and makes it easier for people who aren't close to technology to then engage with the debate. Also, what this does help with sometimes is, or how I've used this, is as a storyboard for our own team. So it gives our own team a chance to discuss, actually, what is our job? What is our portfolio actually trying to do? So everyone has that shared understanding of practically how we tying ourselves together. Oh, forgive me, I've skipped 2 slides ahead. Let me just hop back. And then that, of course, can then be summarized in a sort of statement of what our team is therefore doing. So this was actually the last segment which our team built on our strategic story. And we introduced another little image of technology carrying the NHS, if you look at bottom right, and of giving sort of leadership to the urgent and emergency care space, or the digital element of that urgent and emergency care space. And for everyone who really loves business cases, we've put all those images into our business case, because it simplifies our strategic narrative and simplifies how we simplifies how we explain what we do. Oh, sorry, resting on my keyboard. Right, so moving on, here's a second element. Now, let's take it down a level. Instead of the portfolio where you're looking across all these products, take it down into an individual project or program or initiative. Forgive me, I'm using those terms interchangeably because it depends sometimes on your methodological background, what you call it. But you're delivering a single thing or looking to deliver a single outcome. And for this example, I'll speak about my experience of delivering change during COVID. So in my previous role, I worked within primary care and in the Eastern region. And when I took on the role in the transformation team, my job was to increase the uptake of online and video consultations amongst GP surgeries. There's 88 of them across the Eastern region. And we were sitting at about 20% and 40%. And I was racking my brains about how could we get more GPs using this tool and giving people easier access to their services. And it turns out the answer was really simple. All you needed to do was have a global pandemic. Because as soon as COVID came, that was done within 3 weeks. It was done incredibly quickly. And not through my hard work. It's through the amazing work of all the GPs, their teams, and some of the teams in NHS England and NHS Digital. But then one of the challenges we had afterwards is trying to understand what's been the impact on people. Because what I was hearing often in discussions was a very binary sort of discussion. Either it was tech's bad because old people can't use technology, which is incidentally one of the biggest myths I've come across most consistently, or it was tech's brilliant because our Secretary of State loves technology and it's the way of the future. And we don't have to see all these messy patients face to face now. And those two extremes I didn't feel were fully capturing well, what I wasn't hearing there was actually the patient experience. So we commissioned some research to speak to actual real life people and find out what their experience was around accessing digital primary care. And then we summarized their stories. And what I'll do is I'll pause now because I'll play you the video that we created afterwards to sort of bring their stories to life.
First came the shock of 2020, then inspiration, as the NHS adapted to delivering more digital care. Naturally, we want to know what we can learn from all this. We have lots of data on the number of people receiving digital care, but our priority must be the people themselves. How have they found these new ways of working? What are their stories? Yeah, good thanks. That's Paul's well-worn reply on his daily video calls. But really, he's been struggling with his mental health for a while now. He's young, he grew up online, so he feels silly saying he finds email consultations with his GP so regimented and impersonal. It's difficult to trust someone when you can't see or hear them. My doctor just assumes that because I am young that I will be okay communicating online. Lynn has to admit there are some real upsides to all this. Taking care of her mum is so much simpler now. She can book appointments online and talk to the GP over video. I didn't have to get in the car to drive to the GP, which takes time out of your day. The new normal has O'Day feeling like a middleman. As a long-time carer for his wife, he'd learnt how to hack the system and get things done. But now, it's like he's back to square one. It's frustrating that I have to jump through so many hoops. Dolly doesn't really do computers, let alone smartphones. So, and she knows this sounds funny, it's as if her GP practice just disappeared. She sits in her pyjamas listening to that ghastly hold music, in between messages telling her to stay away. I feel I am totally fading into the background, like I am not important anymore. These stories represent the many we gathered to understand the real experiences of the people we care for. We need to learn from them, to see where some people benefit and where others don't. What can you do, no matter how big or small, for Dolly, O'Day, Lynn and Paul? There's so much more to these stories. To see the full report and discover more people's experiences, visit the address on screen.
Wonderful. So that was the video we created, and as you heard, actually, what it brought out was a much more nuanced picture of what digital the projects meant. It wasn't a very simple binary, if you're old you're going to hate it, if you're young you're going to love it. It was much more subtle. So for example, in Paul's story, brought out something we heard quite a lot, was that digital could be good for most things but not for everything. And similarly, we had to, you had to think about providing appropriate care to people who might, as is in Paul's case, we heard other stories of some people locking themselves in the toilet, waiting a call back from their GP because they didn't want their parents to hear they were on the phone talking about their mental health. So, we had that sort of subtlety and nuance in there. Similarly, the story of, oh gosh, Jane, and the care for her mum through online consults. That was the big surprise to me, is how popular online consultations were, because I thought they were when I got given the job of increasing people's use, I thought they were a bit of a lame duck, but certainly they've proved popular with patients, and equally, even though clinicians have felt where it is in place that it leads to an increase in the calls for service, it does give them another way to manage demand. But I'll come back to that in more detail in a second. And I think it also called out the fact, like in O'Day's story, that very often we don't make things easy for most patients, which most of the listeners you'll probably know, because we're all patients at some time or another, and it's not always easy to get through. But that becomes doubly complicated when you're a carer, and doubly complicated when you're dealing with complex health needs. So how did we use that? So what really surprised me, actually, because I kind of did this thinking, I just really want to get patient stories out there and use them as an engine for change. And what was really quite heartening is that people really liked it. So I approached our regional director thinking she'd be too busy, and also, can you sort of launch an event we're going to have to discuss sort of patient stories and health inequalities and digital? And she was like, yep, definitely, I'll be along. I'll do the opening, I'll do the closing, which really surprised me. And we got a pretty good attendance to the event of people from across the Eastern region who would come. We came together and almost used the background research, of course, but then used the video as a springboard for discussions around particular issues around patient groups. And that's why we framed the video quite open-ended. We said, these are their stories. What will you do where you are that could make people's life better? So that then segued into a discussion around what action people could take. And it certainly made a lot of the discussions around digital technology more tangible and more immediate. And of course, follow the link if you want to see more of that report. I'll pause again to see if any questions have come through, and then And then I'll go to the last thing.
Yep, brilliant, Brin. We've got a few questions popping in and some for you to consider. One around, and I suppose it links into a couple of the other questions, around how do you encourage team bonding through storytelling, and how can you build in that interpretation? How do you build the skill sets up, and do you use any particular visual aids and technology to help you build those storyboards?
I will bundle all that up in a one. So I'll start with the last part. Any visual aids I use, well, because our team's more or less sort of almost entirely virtual. Although I'm meeting team members today, but that's the second time I've met most of them in the almost year I've been with the team. We will use. There's a number of online things you can use. I think Teams has a chat function, but we've used mural boards or Google Jamboards. Both work equally well as a way to to present a story, get discussion, and then what the reason I focus just on a few key images is because I felt if I wrote the story out, it would give people the impression that the story was already told. Like I decided what I wanted to say and I was just running it past them. When actually, if you keep it a little bit high level, people can then project themselves into the story more, and they can add pieces and you can tweak it as you go. And you can use different metaphors, like a metaphor of a journey. So you could say about, what are the barriers we have to cross on this road? Where is the road foggy, et cetera, so they can then build on it. And it also leaves that space for people to build on your metaphor. So, for example, I remember using the metaphor of building a bridge, and someone said, no, it's not really like a bridge, is it? It's kind of like sailing the ocean. And then they built their own metaphor. And then people would sort of chip in and say, yeah, it's a sailing an ocean, but we need a lighthouse. Okay, brilliant. So we got a lighthouse. Okay, guys. So what's the lighthouse? That's our vision. Okay. So you get a bit more flexibility. In terms of, you said, I think the second half of the question was about interpretation and how do you build the skill sets for doing that. One way to build some skill sets is to come to the follow-up webinars, plug, where I'd give you some hints on building stories. I think there are quite a few different frameworks and structures you could use to structure a story, or to learn more about storytelling. I think my sense is don't get hung up on which is the best, or don't get too hung up on, oh my God, I need training. I would always advocate sort of test and experiment and find out what works for you, because humans are storytelling animals. We're surrounded by stories. We use stories whether we mean to or not. And so anyone who's listening will have the ability to put together a basic chain of cause and effect, which is all a story is. This happened, then that happened, then that happened, and then create the beginnings of a story. I would say, though, when we get to the end, we will have a poll which will ask, what are the elements you'd like to learn about more in the follow-up webinars? And then I'll know when I'm running those webinars exactly the things you want to explore in more depth. And your final point was around team bonding. How do you encourage team bonding? Now, I find that is, you can do that just through the process of going through a storyboard, but I think it's sometimes more powerful when you bond based on common human experience. And by that I mean, Carl Rogers, the counselor, the sort of the counseling psychologist, he said that which is most personal is most universal. And it's something I think we've all seen during COVID, is you think very differently about your colleagues when you sort of saw them every day on the video call through COVID, and their kids would barge in, or they would look terrible, or they were ill and still dialing in. And all of those elements, that human element, is often what binds people together. And what stories allow us to do is sometimes consciously bring to the fore our own emotions, our own vulnerability, and that's a really good way to bind teams together. Yeah, but I'll pause there. Should we take one more question before I go to the last bit? The last way you can.
Yeah, just one last question. I think it links in with some of the things that you've said, Brin, but how do you convey uncertainty and tie that to data for a simple story?
I think there's two questions in there. It's like, one is, how do you convey uncertainty? And the second is tying together with data. I think my view of data and story is that they often represent two different versions of reality. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. And that's often how we think of it in healthcare. We think a story is like the least valid and reliable piece of evidence. It's kind of the bottom of the food chain of evidence, and that ladder then builds up to right at the top. You've got sort of blind clinical trials, blind controlled clinical trials. But actually, when we're talking about human experience, I think that it is less of a hierarchy, because, for example, I can speak to you for ages about neurology, as I did in the opener, and what brain chemicals are going on when you're listening to a story. But that doesn't capture your human experience of listening to the story. And similarly, we can talk for hours about A&E performance and how our figures are, we've seen a statistically significant rise in longer than 4-hour waits, but that doesn't capture the experience of somebody who is stuck in A&E for 8, 9, 10 hours and scared. So again, it's how I would use them is I'd use it as a duet. So you want to use story and facts and figures as a duet. And my preference is sometimes you hook people in with the story, and then you hit them with the figures. And in that process, you can convey uncertainty. You can say, there's something we don't know. Or you can call out the fact that, this experience, what the figures are telling me, is not matching the stories we're hearing. And that's giving us some sort of something we obviously need to explore in more depth. But I'll bring us on there, because it does tie in to the last way you can use stories to motivate for change. So in the process of running the research that led to the video that I've just showed you, the researcher called me one afternoon and said, "Brin, I've got this great story for you, but I can't use it in the final product because it's a friend of a friend." And she then went on to say, he's someone who's only got a pay-as-you-go mobile phone, and he burned through 60 quid on his pay-as-you-go mobile phone. So actually, my heading's not correct. There wasn't a bill. You just pay the money up front, trying to get through to his GP. And he just gave up. And he only got to see a GP when he burst out in tears in the pharmacy. And a pharmacist said, "No, that's not right. Stay there. I'm going to phone them and make sure you get an appointment and you get seen." And what made that story interesting was because it better than anything expressed the need for people to be able to access the service. And how I used that, and I used it in a couple of forums, is as a way to get people thinking about why we need to do something before we get on to what we need to do. So if I was doing it in classic NHS England facts-driven style, I'll say, we can see that the overall usage for online consultations and video consultations, everyone's got the technological capability, but only about 80% of you, or 65%, I think it topped out as 65% of you are using it. So we want to see a 10% increase over the next month. And then we'll check. That's going to create resistance. And by using that story, and you don't need to announce, I never announced it. I never said, here's a story I'm about to tell you to motivate you to do something different. You just introduce it in the beginning of a meeting. And I did it in a meeting with practice managers. And for those of you who know anything about primary care, practice managers are the people working in the engine room. They're going to keep the practice running. They're going to be the people who often have the really tough things to do with IT. And they're also them and the receptionists, so the people that are going to have to be often the first people who are the contact with this wave of online demand. So we were discussing, how do we increase online consultations? I opened the meeting with this story, and to my surprise, the first person to come in was a practice manager, a lady who'd been recommended because they said she was very experienced and very outspoken, which is excellent. And she said, she listened to the story and said, that's why we need online consultation. So we can get all you middle-class people putting your problems online because you've got Wi-Fi access. So our phones are open for the £60 mobile phone bill guy. So, and it surprised me that actually people had responded so clearly to the story, and consistently people did, because that was expressing why we do the job. So that would be my other hint for people listening, is using stories, even little anecdotes like the one I just told, as a way to frame a conversation or move a meeting forward. So to summarize, and I know we've got about 8 minutes left, so I'll summarize, and then we'll come pick up more questions in the poll. Is 3 reasons why you should use stories. There's 3 ways you can use it, and those are the 3 reasons. You can build it. It's to build engagement, creating relationships within your team and between your team and others. Increase your ability to influence people. Yes, there are loads of tools out there to run a project and to manage stakeholders. This is just a really handy tool to add to your toolkit. And then, of course, supporting adoption. So once you've implemented the technology, once you've installed the toilet, adoption is about getting people to use the toilet and stop going in the garden. Adoption is often the thing that is the most challenging in a digital program. But by telling a story, by continually coming back to this is why we do the work we're doing, then you can increase the likelihood of successful adoption. And I'll pause for questions. Again.
There's another question, Brin, asking what's been your greatest story to date, and why was it so successful?
Ooh, what a good question. Funny enough, £60 mobile phone guy has been quite successful given its simplicity, and given the ability to say it really quickly. And I know it sounds obvious, but you very often in a meeting, as most of you listening will know, you don't have a lot of time, and people don't always have. People in a room might not have patience with you saying, "Everyone stop! I'm about to tell you a story." It might not feel appropriate, but putting in the ability to put in an anecdote that lasts about 30 seconds long is great, is really handy. And that's something I've used with various anecdotes and stories. And sign up to the webinar. I'll show you some good hints for finding stories and then developing your anecdotes and honing them. So that was a good one. It gave me a lot of faith in the approach. Slightly off topic, but I think some of the most profound stories we can tell are the stories we tell about ourselves. So in terms of some of the stories I've been most proud of, it's when you're telling a story about someone's perception of themselves or of a problem, and seeing that if you change the story, you suddenly change the whole perception of what the problem is. But don't worry, I won't go to over disclosing, but probably some of my proudest stories are the work I've done on changing my own stories.
Brilliant. I think that's it so far, Brin.
Perfect. So feel free to keep popping the questions in, and I know if anyone has details of my bio, you are more than happy to drop comments in there. Before we close, though, I will just give you yet another plug for our follow-up webinars, but most importantly, a poll. So what I would like to do is have I'm running a poll to find out what of the areas of everything that I covered that would be most interesting for you to hear more about. Because there is a lot more to unpack. There are certainly something we didn't touch on today is some of the blockers as to why people often don't use stories or are scared of using stories, or some of the beliefs we have around stories. So yeah, I can see the poll results up on my screen. Forgive me, they're a little bit small, so I can't see who's winning. What are the suggestions that are coming out really strongly? Wonderful. Wonderful. So sorry, and yeah, and so you wouldn't have been able to hear, but I was getting someone whispering in my ear to say that so far we've got the techniques for telling strategic stories are coming out really popular, tools for finding stories, and then basic guide for structuring stories, which actually fits together really nicely because there are some very simple things you can do to give you a bit of a head start. Excellent. Well, if there are no questions, I would just like to thank Karen, Agatha, and the team for giving me the opportunity to come here today and speak. As you can tell, I could speak all day about this, but it's been a real pleasure and a privilege. And thank you to everyone for listening and engaging in stories and on the poll.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brin. That was really enlightening, and you've definitely generated some energy in the room to find out more about storytelling, which was the intention. So well done. That was absolutely brilliant. Really look forward to those future podcasts. So absolutely delighted about that. And for everybody else, thank you for your time. We'd encourage you to carry on giving us feedback, send questions into Brin, and also to complete the end of the session survey so as we can continually improve our approaches. So thank you to the team, and also just before we go, a very, very big thank you. And if you want to put a round of applause, hands claps into the chat box for Brin, that would be very, very welcome in our virtual hand clapping. And the next session is session 6 with Mark and Ben on how to ensure your complex programs are set up for success. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, everybody.